webinar that is JOSM for beginners. And we're just waiting a couple minutes to see if there's any late joiners, and then we're going to get started in just about 60 seconds here. Okay, I think we'll just go ahead and get started, and as people join, that's okay, but we'll just get going. So I just put in again, my name is Blake Gerardo, and I'm from the Training Working Group, and I'm also one of the disaster coordinators here at HOT, and we use JOSM all day long, and it's really, it's a great tool. It's an incredible piece of software, and we think that if you can use JOSM, you'll be a lot happier and more productive probably, and be able to do a lot more things here at HOT if you're competent at using JOSM. So we're going to try and give you the basics of it today. The plan is that we have an agenda that I just shared. So there's a link in the chat, and that's the agenda that, essentially the agenda in the outline document of what we're going to cover today. And I encourage you to follow along with it. I'm going to do my best to follow along with it and make notes as you go along. If you have any questions, you can type them in the chat. At any point in the presentation, you can type questions in the chat. Russ is serving as the technical host, so Russ will read all of your questions, and if he can answer them, he will, and if not, he'll interrupt me, and we'll get your question answered. So feel free to ask questions. There's a built-in question and answer period after most of the major sections, so that'll also be a good chance to get clarification. And then we have this idea that we also have a project that we can work on. So we're going to go through about an hour of instruction, and then we have another 30 minutes allocated for actual practical work, in which case we're going to share a URL with you that's to the tasking manager, and it's mapping in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And you're just going to map, and we're going to be online here, and you can share your screen and ask questions and say, I don't understand this, or it doesn't work when I try and use the building tool. And the screen share works really well, so it's super easy to show us. So you'll get some practical hands-on too, hopefully at the end of this if you have time for it. But if not, you'll just get the instruction in the beginning. With that, I'm going to pause for a moment and see if any of my colleagues on the Training Working Group are interested in introducing themselves and saying hello.
Yes, well, hi. This is Michael. I'm currently the chairman of the tracking group, and you will hear more from me during this webinar because I'll take over the intermediate part right in the middle of this presentation. The beginning and the end will be hosted by Blake, and of course you can always ask me some more details in the end. Thanks.
Okay, I think with that, then we're just going to get started, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So let's see. I do want to continue to share my screen, and I'm going to share my desktop. And hopefully everybody can see my desktop. Could Russ, can you see my desktop just fine?
Upon clicking, I can see your desktop, Blake, thanks.
Yeah, I can see it better than I can find the mute button, so you're good.
Yeah, it's coming through fine on this end as well, Blake.
All right, perfect. One thing you might notice is all of my keystrokes and my clicks are displayed in the lower left-hand corner. So when you're watching this, don't pay too much attention to it. If it gets annoying, somebody can speak up and say that's kind of annoying, and I'm happy to turn it off. But that's what's popping up down here is every time I click my mouse, etc., it displays it for you. So I've just started up JOSM. And I always, so let me just look here. So JOSM requirements. So JOSM requires Java. You need to have the latest version of the Java runtime environment installed on your local machine. We're assuming that everybody has done that at this point in time. Unfortunately, there's just not enough time for us to help with Java install, but it seems to go fairly well once you get the whole Java, the Java runtime installed. As a Windows user, I always download the Java exe, and I just run the installer and it installs it. And when I need to upgrade, I just download the exe again, and I run the exe and it upgrades, and it's always been perfect. It's never been a problem. That's how I do it. So anyhow, you got to have Java, and I typically use the exe on Windows. I know other options will work on Mac OS. Sometimes there can be a bit of a version issue, but other than that, it should work fine. And it also works wonderfully on Linux. I install it on Linux all the time. There's instructions for that on the JOSM website. But this is what a brand new installed copy of JOSM looks like. You know, it's always a good idea to read over this stuff. It will tell you if you need to update JOSM. I'm using the latest version, so everything's good. If I wasn't, it would give me a notice right here. And so the very first thing you do when you install JOSM is you need to configure the preferences. Okay, let's see. So I'm into this part. We're doing the install and pre-install, and we're going to start doing the preferences. And I am going to roughly go for 10 minutes on this. So the menu system is essentially the same. You know, these file and edit menus are on just about every application, and I'm going to go to edit preferences. The first thing that I'd like you all to do when you're editing your preferences is come down here and enable expert mode. This changes the amount of preferences that you have, and it'll also change what shows up on menus and things like that. So it's always a good idea to have this marked, and you'll see every available option. And most people have this marked. So if you're looking for help, they're quite often going to give it to you in reference of having that expert mode turned on. So turn on expert mode. The very next thing that we want to go to are the connection settings. And so what we're going to do is, this is much like ID, where you have to log into OpenStreetMap so that you can upload and save your changes. The same thing applies to JOSM, except you authorize once with the application, and then it can automatically log you on and off. So you'll want to use this OAuth setting rather, use OAuth, and then say authorize now, so we get this out of the way and it doesn't come up later. And it asks you for your OpenStreetMap username and password. Okay, hold on one second here. I can't have every keystroke displayed on my password. Okay. And then I'm going to say authorize now. And it just works. Okay, so it went out and it did its thing. I'm going to turn this back on. It went out and it did its thing, and it generated these access tokens. And this is so it's not storing any of your credentials in clear text. So it's going to store these two things. I usually say test the access tokens, which are what just got generated. So I'll say test those, and it almost always says successful. And I'm going to accept those access tokens, and that's it. So this now works. I could test it. I could create a new one, but you only have to do this one time. So you want to go to this. This is the second tab down, and it's your connection settings, and you'll want to go and do your connection settings. The very next thing that's probably the most important to install to get set up is what we call the remote control settings. And the remote control settings are what enable the tasking manager to communicate directly with JOSM. So this lets the tasking manager control your JOSM, which you'll see when we do the tasking manager section. But generally what you want to do is you want to enable. Just click enable remote control. Whatever these defaults are fine. And then we're going to go through a similar process like we did for logging in. We're going to say enable HTTPS support. And you can see that enables this install button. So when I check that, it says install. This is super similar to having created our tokens before. And it said, you know, it gives you a little bit of a dialogue, but just say okay. This is all fine. Just say yes. And that's it. So that was successfully happened. So that's all you need to do to enable the HTTP support. But that lets those things communicate. And let's see here. So now the fun part, okay, those were the fun, or that was kind of the bookkeeping part that we had to do. But the little bit more fun part about JOSM is now we're going to go to the plugins option. And the plugins option is where we can sort of get all kinds of additional, little tools that we can add into JOSM. And this UI can be a little bit confusing. When you first click on it, you have to download the list, and this actually gets it from a wiki. So this gets a list of all the available plugins. And the first plugin that you should install is the Buildings Tools plugin. And you can sort of scroll through and find it. These are alphabetical. But typically what we do is we search. And so I say Buildings Tool, and it brings it right to the top. And this is the tool that you're going to map the most. I'll go out on a limb, and I'll say this is the tool you're going to use the most in JOSM as a mapper or even as a validator, is this Buildings tool. So I'm going to check the Buildings tool because that's one of the ones that I want to install. And then the other one is a little bit more complicated, but it's called the Utils plugin. And so it's Utils plugin 2. So I'm going to want to check that one. And then when you're all done, you can leave this up here or not. But I've now checked 2 plugins that are going to be installed, Utils 2 and the Building Tools plugin. And that's really all you need to get started. Other plugins will get installed as we go along. But now I'll just say update plugins. And this actually goes out and downloads the plugins and installs them. And it tells me that these have been downloaded successfully. And I'm just going to say OK. And then I come down to this bottom set of buttons. And I say, well, when I'm done with, I generally do this out of habit, which I'm just going to do it now out of habit. I'm going to say, OK. And now this usually tells me, this happens to me quite often. I get an error that says, oh, it couldn't load the plugin. And I think it's just a timing thing. But always say keep plugin. And then it tells me it couldn't install the Building Tools plugin. So just say keep plugin. And then I generally come up to the File menu and I choose Restart. And that will restart JOSM for me and make sure that all of the plugins that I wanted to add are added. And generally, you don't get any kind of an error on the restart. So this gets everything installed properly, and the software knows about where it all is, and everything is good. So I'm just going to jump back up to preferences here real quick. I've given you the basic preferences, which is this global control or the global login. Then we looked at a couple of plugins to install, and that was about it. We also did the remote control so that you can connect, and I think I'm going to call that good. That's really all you need for preferences when you initially install JOSM. And this thing is now ready to use. It's ready to download data, upload data, and we're ready to go. So I did plugins. And now okay, so next on our agenda is sort of just a jump into the UI. Let's see, I haven't heard anybody speak up, so there must not be any questions on the preferences part, but so I'll carry on. So now there's an introduction to the UI. And when you first start up JOSM, it looks a little, this is essentially a web page. And like I said, you should look through it and make sure it's your latest version of things. But for the most part, you'll read this once and you won't have to look at it again. Just to learn to use JOSM when you first start, the first thing that I would always do is I would go up to the File menu and I would choose New Layer. And we haven't talked about layers yet, but we're going to talk about layers extensively. But what this does is this creates a new data layer that holds OpenStreetMap data. There's nothing on it. I haven't downloaded any data to it. I haven't created any new data. But I definitely have a data layer. And you can see the reason that I do that is because that gets the rest of the UI to appear. So you can start to see the full UI of JOSM once you have a layer, basically. None of this shows up until there's a layer to do something with. And so, we looked at the menus. These menus are, let's see, let me just make sure I'm following this clearly. The menus, a couple of them are standard, and then most of these are quite specific, except for the help menu, to JOSM. These menus can change. That's something you should know. Plugins can add options to your menus. It can also add complete menus based on plugins. So I can't promise they're always going to look exactly like this. And you should be aware that they can actually change. Probably the most, the menu that you're going to use perhaps the most at some points in time is the preset menu. This is essentially the same thing that you did in ID, where in ID you sort of had a graphical set of presets on the left-hand side. This is essentially that exact same interface, except it's through a menu. But other than that, it's, you know, nested collections of presets. But the menus across the top are pretty straightforward. Over here along the left-hand side, which is this area here along this left-hand side, this can look a little bit hard to figure out, but it's a little bit easier than it looks. This top group of icons are tools that you use for manipulating data on one of the layers. So right now I have the selection tool selected. You're going to want to learn the shortcut key for the selection tool. We have a list of all the shortcut keys that you just need to learn, and they're in that agenda document at the bottom. And hopefully most of them are listed throughout the agenda so you know which keys we're talking about when. But really the key to using JOSM effectively is going to be to use your shortcut keys. There's only about 10. You'll learn them pretty quick, but they're required learning once you start using JOSM, is use these keys. Otherwise, using the mouse can almost be the same or more difficult than ID. But once you learn the shortcut keys, everything goes super fast. This is tools that you use for creating things on this data layer. This big black area, this is called the viewport. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add another layer, a little bit out of order here, but I'm going to add another layer. And you can see that the viewport is where there's data and where there's imagery. And then the rest of this around it is about what's in this viewport. So these were tools that I could use to draw on this layer, my data layer, my OpenStreetMap data layer. And, you know, there's the selection tool. This draws lines. This lets me zoom in. This deletes nodes. You'll learn to use about 3 or 4 of these extensively. Here's our building tool. If I wanted to jump in here and draw buildings, this is one of the ways I could get the building tool. It's also the B key. Back to the S key to get the selection tool. My recommendation is that for the most part, you stay on the selection tool unless you're actively mapping. So you'll get used to hitting that S key to get your selection tool back, because you want to not accidentally cut something in half by clicking while you're dragging around. One of the things that I want you to notice is moving the viewport is always done with a right mouse click. And I think I'm skipping ahead, but moving the viewport is always done with this right mouse click. I'm holding on my right mouse button and that lets me move the viewport. Regular left button mouse clicks are, you know, for selecting objects and things like that, pretty much like you're used to. But this is tools. Somebody unmuted themselves. Is there a question? Okay, I'm going to move along. And so this bottom set of icons these are toggle switches. These turn things on and off. And what these turn on and off are these panels over on the right-hand side. So these are little information panels that you can decide which ones you want to have open and which ones you want to have closed. And then you can turn them on and off over here. So for instance, this is the tags panel, an information panel that I always want up. You really don't use these a ton. Oftentimes you'll get what you typically use set up over in the panels, and then that's it. Once in a while, you might want to turn on a different panel because you want to control a little bit of different information. But this is really your scarce real estate on your screen, is the panels that you can have open and being able to see the data in those panels. So let's see, changeable tools, left-hand tool selection, we went over those. Left-hand panels toggle, that's what we're going over now. And so that's what these things do. They toggle these on and off. Generally, you're going to always have your layers panel up here at the top. That you're going to always have open. Tags and memberships are also what you're going to have open. And tags and memberships, I'm just going to go ahead and draw, I'm just going to draw a square. Tags and memberships, and S to get my selection key, and this is what's selected. And I click on this, and this has no tags, and it's not a member of anything. So this is displaying information about OpenStreetMap tags on whatever your selected object is. And then the other one that I want open is the selection. You know, one of these says selection. You can find it. This is probably it. This tells you what you have selected. So this is information about that object, and this is the actual physical object itself. And it's a way because it's line, and it has 4 nodes. And you generally want to have this panel open as well. These are the 3 that I typically work with. What might else be on my panel list? changes based on what I'm doing. But these three are the core panels: layers, tags and memberships, and then the selection panel. Let's see here. Those are the ones that you want to have open. I might have skipped ahead. That might have been listed someplace else. That's essentially the only other thing that's super important in this UI. I mean, we can go over these things in a little bit more detail, but the other thing that's super important in this UI is down here are the coordinates. And if you click on these coordinates, I guess I double clicked. It brings up a dialog box. And I just want to point out this bottom URL, you can copy and paste and share with people. So I can copy this and share it with somebody else, and then they can get to this exact point in JOSM. They can also get to this exact point because you can just paste it into a web browser, and they can get to this exact point in ID. You can also copy the URL out of the ID editor and put it in here, and it will jump you to exactly that spot in ID. So this is a little kind of a hidden UI thing that's super important, and it's down here and it's under these. The other thing...
Real quick, let me jump in. So Deval asked, and I just want to clarify the question, Deval. The red box, that's just when it is selection or selected. So yeah, when it's not selected, it's a gray box, and when it actually is selected, it turns red.
Yep, that's exactly right. And you know, you'll often find that having something selected is the easiest way to find it in the map if you're lost. It's super common to just do Control A to select all and then zoom out and find out where it is and zoom in. But yeah, red means it's selected and gray means it's not selected. And you know, this is mostly true. That's true for the most part. Might not always be true, but I think that's true for the most part. And so I'm just gonna, you know, I just clicked on this thing to select it. This was just random drawing, but I'm gonna go ahead and just delete it so that it's no longer on my data layer. Okay, so the tools, I guess I'm going to introduce some tools here. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm actually going to introduce some of the tools that are in this UI, but that's the overview of the UI. Presets, you can search presets. This is very similar to ID. So you could put in cemetery, and you could find, you know, sort of some options for cemetery, like places grave or cemetery. And then much like ID, oh, I didn't have anything selected. Okay, great. So I'm just going to go ahead and draw my untagged box, and I'm going to go to presets and I'm going to say search, and it remembers some of the last things that I've searched on. But let's say I searched on cemetery, and much like ID, it will give you other options that you might not know the answer to. But this would let you put in, you know, and if I don't know the name, I can just say apply preset. And over here in my panels window, now you can see, whoops. So escape key is the other key you're going to learn a lot, and you know, of course, Control Z for undo, because you're going to accidentally click places, which is why you want your S key to get back to your selection tool. And so I can left or I can right click and drag. But anyhow, my point being, this is now selected, so it turned red, and you can see now there's some information here where I have a land use and it's cemetery. So it put those values on there. Those are tags. So it doesn't always look quite the same when it's selected and not selected. Now that this has a tag, if I took this tag off, you can see I come back and now I'm just back to my regular gray screen. So I'm going to quickly go over these tools and see if this goes over right. We already talked about the S key, which gets you your selection tool. There's two kinds. If you hit the S key once, it gives you a standard box to kind of group things. If you hit the S key twice or get it to the one where it lets you draw a lasso, you know, then you can grab just the certain objects that you want. You can directly click on things to select it, but get used to hitting the S key to select something, and its companion key, the escape key, to make sure that nothing is selected. You'll use those two a lot. Get your select tool and then escape to make sure it's not selected. So the other, I feel like this is not going quite according to plan. But the other tool that I want you to be aware of that I think I'll go over later in this presentation when we're actually editing buildings. But the other one that's super important that's on your list of must-learns is the Create Areas tool, or the X tool for extruding. So get familiar with this tool. You'll get a lot better chance to look at it. But this lets you make really odd-shaped buildings by putting a cut point in, and I'm double-clicking, and then you grab it, and you can push and pull that wall in and out. And you can add as many cut points as you want. And this makes, you know, very detailed mapping of buildings quite easy. So that's the other one that we want you to learn. And then the building tool key. The very last one over here. Remember, this is where the tools are stored. So I just showed you the selection tool. I showed you the cut tool. And now I'm about to show you this building tool, which is the B key. So make a lot of you will use C and S to switch back and forth between these. And the buildings tool is quite nice because it's just 2 simple clicks. Oops. Again, I'm using my escape key because I accidentally had something selected, which affects how this tool works. So I got it deselected by hitting escape. But you click and you basically go along one side of a building and then it pulls you out a building. I'm going to S key to get my selection tool back. And I'm going to select this. And I can look over here in the tags and panel that this is building equals yes. That's the other nice thing about the building tool is it automatically adds the tags for you. And as I said, what happens is if you have another building selected, it will restrict to make sure that they all at least are in line, if not the same size, which is why I had to hit the escape key to draw a building that was not in line with them because nothing could be selected.
So I'm going to jump in. Emily, I might need more info. So if you look at the chat, like how to make a selection stay on the screen, yet I'm a little confused on the question. I'm kind of guessing that maybe you're just clicking elsewhere, and yeah, that makes the selection invalidated. It unselects if you click just okay. randomly outside of the.
I get it. Yeah, I understand that question. So I got my selection tool back. I hit the S key. I could have come over here, and that's right. I'm clicking on these things to select them. And much like in other programs, if I hold down my Shift key or the Control key, that lets me add to the selection. And to unselect everything, you can just click off, and that'll unselect it. Or like I said, my preferred method of unselecting things is the Escape key, because that makes sure that you don't accidentally click on something else. And I should have also pointed out that I'm using the mouse wheel. I also have a trackpad where I can sort of slide 2 fingers up and down. But for the most part, I have a mouse with a wheel, and that's what I'm using to zoom in and out. That's what I'm using to zoom in and out of this view. And then I'm holding down on my right mouse button and I'm dragging to move it around. If you get lost, and I mean, it's not out of the question that you zoom out and you zoom in over here and I don't have any idea where my things are anymore and I can't find them, right? Now they're gone. Like I said, my advice is you do Control A to select all, and that'll start to bring them up on the screen so you can find them. And even if you don't see them on your screen, as long as you have something selected, you can grab one and I can right click and say zoom to that selection and it'll get it on my screen for me. So yeah, it's possible to lose these things off the screen. So hopefully that answers either one of those questions. Are there any other questions about what I've talked about so far? It's gone kind of fast. And we'll be using these tools when we talk about how to map. This is really just a user interface introduction, and we're going to show you how to actually use these tools in practice. Does anybody have any more questions you want to type in right now about what we've gone over for user interface? Let me just look at those. I'm going to try and look at those, Russ.
Yeah, I think we're figuring it out. Yeah, Emily, it does kind of sound like maybe you don't have the data layer active or something, and like, okay. If it's a real dark gray layer, that means that the data in that layer is kind of unavailable.
This is next up on my list, I think. Is this next up on my list? Panels, viewport, concept of imagery and layers and data. So I think if I move on, that I might answer that particular question. Did anybody else have another question about what we've covered so far? Now that I saw the question is, why can't I select? I think I know the answer. You have a super sensitive zoom, how to dial it down. I don't know. You can also use, as far as a zoom goes, you can also use the plus and the minus key on your keyboard. So I have like a keypad on my laptop and I'm using the plus and the minus for this instead of my scroll wheel, which it's interesting that it doesn't show that on my...
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's not picking it up on your...
Yeah. So I'm using plus and minus to get in and out. So that's another option if this is too much, if the wheel is too much for you. There's also, you can come up and drag this panel to get it zoom in and out, which is still pretty, but let's get to layers and panels. That might address that too. Any other questions about what I've talked about so far? I didn't really talk about any of these buttons. These buttons are another way to get to presets. So this looks very much like the preset highway. So this is sort of another way to get to presets. I tend to never use these. If I need to search for something, I search for it because it was here, or I add the tags directly by clicking on it and then say add. I would come over here and use this add button, and now I can just type it in. This is, building equals yes. So I tend to, I tend to never use these buttons. This button will let us adjust imagery, which will get covered. These are upload and download data buttons. And so we're going to get to layers in a second, and I'll cover those two buttons. Open and save, but the rest of these are preset buttons. I tend to focus on the menus and the keyboard shortcuts. And then the rest of this is literally like 10% of what you do in JOSM. Between keyboard shortcuts and using the couple of the tools that you use, you don't do a ton else. I mean, you'll do more varied mapping, so you might do some different tagging. So I use presets, you'll use presets because we're tagging not just buildings and roads. But any other questions? Were there any other questions about, before I move on? Move the cursor more slowly. Can I make my mouse bigger? Okay, don't move as fast. I'll try and be a little bit better about that. Yep, uploading data we'll cover shortly. Okay. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to now, I think that, I think the part of this that I'm in is the concept of layers, imagery data, and how to load them. So we've already dealt with layers a little bit, and we've seen this layers panel, but we haven't really talked about layers themselves. And this layers panel is a pretty good, this is a pretty good example. Let's just go through this. Data layers and how to obtain, you can have multiple imagery and data layers, only one layer is active. Okay. So what we're looking at here are two layers, and it's also two different kinds of layers. And there's not really a good way to tell them apart, except one type of layer always has this OpenStreetMap icon. And this is what's called the data layer. And the other thing that's important to see here is there's a green checkbox, check mark. And it's currently on this data layer. It doesn't really matter which one is highlighted. The one that has the green check mark is the active layer. So if I have, on this layer, this is the active layer, and because it's active, I can move things and I can edit them and delete them because this is the active layer. But it doesn't happen very often, but you will have other data layers. For the most part, you're probably just gonna have one data layer. If you sort of use a workflow like I typically do, you'll only have one data layer. But you can have more than one data layer. But for now, I'm going to stick with one data layer. But you can, if you find you can't select something, I'm just going to add a new layer. These layers are always data layers. This is a new data layer every time. You add imagery layers, which we'll get to in a second, through the imagery menu. But now you can see I have two things that are labeled OSM data layer. And I guess I probably have a setting somewhere that controls whether or not I can see through here. Yeah, that's interesting. So there's a setting. I've just reset my settings. This is a brand new installation of JOSM. Somewhere there must be a setting that says, let me see these things through here. If anybody on the training working group or anybody else knows, please share it as soon as possible. Because normally you can see editing that's behind here. Aha, here, you can see it a little bit here. So, right. So this is my active layer, and this is my, now I have a new active layer that has nothing on it, or you'd see something bright colored on this layer. And so by whichever check mark is next to your data layer, that's the one that's active. And you might at times, again, S key to get back my selection tool, you might at times see things that are not on your layer that you try and select and you can't because you're not on the layer where that object actually exists. This is not going to come up very often, but you're going to need to be aware of it. There's more than one kind of data layer. And one of the other things you saw in figuring this out is there's an icon right here, and this is an eyeball. And it's extremely hard to see, even not in a webinar. But this is essentially toggles this on and off. So I turn off the visibility by clicking the eyeball icon, and this lets me turn on and off visibility. You can see I have an imagery layer that currently has no visibility. As soon as I turn it back on, now that layer comes into play. I'm going to go ahead and delete my second data layer. On all of these panels, which can be kind of confusing in the UI, there's a trash can. So I can, if I'm in this panel and I click on this trash can, I'm going to delete this layer. I'm going to get a warning that says, hey, I mapped and I forgot to upload, but I'm just going to say delete because I know that was junk. But same thing for down here. If I find tags on it, I can click on it here, and then I can use the little trash can icon that goes with this little panel, and I can delete that tag. And now this is an untagged way. And then you can't really delete anything here, so you don't get a trash can icon. But do notice that certainly for layers, you'll be using this trash can icon to get rid of things. Only one layer is ever going to be active at a time, and you might see other layers in here, other sorts of special layers. But for sure, this is how we check imagery when we're trying to figure out. So we'll get a big, oh, now I have two big imagery layers. That doesn't do me any good. But I'm going to come up to this imagery panel, or the imagery menu, and this lets me add imagery layers. So I can add Digital Globe Premium. You usually get a dialog that says this could be misaligned. We know that. So anytime you load a data layer, it could very well be misaligned. I don't really need a warning every time. But and then there's standard, and then there's, that's about it. Sometimes we work with Esri, and then you can also add Mapbox, of course, and then try and get rid of all your this might be misaligned messages. And now these things, so the other concept with layers is they can be stacked. So if I were trying to, for example, figure out which imagery I should use, I shouldn't use Mapbox Satellite. This is the top layer, so this is the one I'm seeing. And when I turn it off, the next thing I see is the next layer down, which is Esri World Imagery. But I'm definitely not going to use Mapbox because there's no high resolution. So I'm going to delete that from my layers list. And now I see Esri, and if I turn off Esri, I can see that Digital Globe Standard is definitely different. Esri looks to be exactly the same as the Digital Globe Premium, so I don't need to worry about the Esri. I can delete the Esri. And Digital Globe Premium, by toggling it on and off, I can see that it's exactly the same as Bing. So I don't need to worry about Digital Globe Premium. And now I start to just do my comparison where they're different. But the only reason I can do that is because I'm stacking these layers and I'm turning them on and off to see what's underneath them. You also have some interesting controls. So you can add an imagery layer that is, for example, rendered. So I'm just going to add the standard open image or the OpenStreetMap map layer for this area, and it's going to load really slow. But you can absolutely have layers that are not imagery and not data. This is a rendered layer. And this gives you a good opportunity to see that for every layer, you also can adjust how its transparency. So I could, tone down the transparency on this map layer and start to see some stuff behind it. And sometimes you'll use this, for comparing imagery, but just be aware it's there. You don't use it very often, but you definitely will adjust the imagery layers. You can adjust how they look like. Again, there's still only one active data layer. Even imagery layers can be active layers. And now that, I have some things that I could do to this imagery layer because now it's the active layer that I can't do when it's not the active layer. But for the most part, your active layer is going to be a data layer, and you're going to be turning on and off imagery layers for mapping. Anybody have any questions about that so far? Any questions about the layers or the imagery so far? Okay, great. So I'm just going to carry on then. And so still going through this, the one thing that you need to know about layers is probably how to align imagery. And so I'm going to get rid of my data layer. That has junk on it, but I'm going to say I'm going to delete that data layer. So now all of my tools are grayed out. I can't use any of the drawing tools because I don't have a data layer to work with. And so typically what you would do is you would download the data from OpenStreetMap. And so I'm just going to do that. I'm going to download this data from OpenStreetMap. And so now I didn't create any of this. I have a data layer. It automatically created a data layer for me, and it's data layer 3. And it downloaded whatever was in OpenStreetMap. And you can see there's not too much in OpenStreetMap for this area. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use Digital Globe. I'm going to go ahead and use Digital Globe Standard Imagery. And I'm going to map, well, no, it's not true. I'm going to use Bing Imagery, and I'm going to map in a few buildings. I'm going to use the B key to get my building tool. I'm going to knock a couple of buildings out real quick. There's 2 buildings all mapped and tagged. Everything is set. That's that. But now somebody tells me, oh, you know, this digital globe standard imagery is newer. So now, you know, somebody's already done mapping. They used Bing like we always use, and it's in a certain alignment. And we're going to discuss how to align the background imagery. So I'm going to switch to something like digital globe standard. And now you can see my mapping. Hopefully you can see my mapping. I'm going to hit the S key. I want my selection tool. You can see my mapping is misaligned. Obviously, if I'm to continue mapping, I need to fix this somehow. And the way that you always fix it, unless somebody tells you different, the way that you always fix it is to align this background imagery with the existing mapping. And the way that we do that is we click on this button that has, you know, it's green and it has an arrow that points in every direction. So I'm going to click on that button, and now it lets me decide which imagery I want to align. And I'm going to align the digital globe standard imagery because that's what I want to map from. And it gives you this dialog box in the middle of the screen, which is usually not where you want it. And it says that currently my offset is 0, 0. So I'm just going to come into the middle of the map, and I'm going to hold down with the right mouse button, and I get a 4 points icon. And I'm just going to drag this imagery until it aligns with that mapping. And it tells me what I did. I offset it 1.94 meters by 0.9 meters. And now it matches, and I say, okay. And now that background imagery is aligned. And you can do that for any of the, you know, for any imagery that you have out. If I got out the, you know, the Esri world imagery, it's already aligned exactly the same way. There's almost no, that was the same as something else. It's just lower resolution. But you can align each one of these imagery layers. And it's interesting, this is new. It shows you an icon that says this has been aligned, and there's a red arrow and a little green icon. That's brand new. That never showed that before. So that's interesting. But that's how you align the imagery. And if you need to set it back, you have to come back and click on this button. We did digital globe standard, and you can set it back by typing 0, semicolon 0. And now it'll snap back to what it originally was. You can also just delete the layer and re-add it, because it will forget your alignment, I'm fairly sure, between that. But that's how you align imagery. The other thing that's a note on here is, you know, the data layers are always sorted on top, and the imagery layers are always sorted on the bottom. They're never going to intermingle. So you'll always know the stuff on the bottom is imagery, and the stuff on the top is a data layer. This data layer is fine. You know what I mean? There's nothing wrong with this data layer, so I'm just going to upload it. Tells me what I did. I have to have a comment. This was DG standard. I'm not going to revise it. I'm just going to continue as is. So anyhow, map data, might as well do it. And then get rid of your data layers tends to be what I do. I won't get a warning this time. Because all of this data is uploaded, you recall, I deleted another data layer, and it had some data on it. And I went to delete it, and it gave me a warning. But when I go to delete this data layer, there's been no changes to it. So when I say delete, it's just going to get rid of it. And now I don't have that data layer anymore. There's also on here is listed GPS layers and dB offsets are applicable to aligning imagery, and I have those marked as advanced. And those are advanced topics that we won't cover. But there are other ways to deal with imagery alignment options. Anybody have any questions about that part so far? It's going to be hard to start the hands-on part period in 15 minutes. We might have to delay that. It's definitely taking a little bit longer. And so at this point, I'm going to skip walking through the tasking manager. That's going to have to just be a part of a different thing. There's some notes in here, and I'll probably come back to that. And then there's another 15-minute section that's on basic editing. And this is the section that Michael is going to cover, the basics of editing. Thank God. Michael?
Yes, I'm here. So,
okay, well, you saw what I did there, Michael. I definitely covered, a lot more than I had intended to cover. I don't know, it just took a lot longer than I thought. So I think I will turn this over to you for the basic editing part now, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, well, I appreciate everybody putting up with it. The feedback I got was I moved the mouse too fast. But thanks, everybody. And if we have time, we might have to adjust the schedule a little bit once Michael's done. But if we have time, there's an advanced, like a second part to editing, and then there's the hands-on part. So perhaps we can start the hands-on part, and people who want to listen to the second part of the editing, that would be good. But for sure, you're going to need to watch this section. So Michael, maybe even if you saw some of the other advanced editing stuff that fit into it while you're describing it, that would be great. Whatever works.
Yes. Well, let's see. First of all, once again, welcome from me. And yes, well, let's start with the point. The point is the basic object, of course. In humanitarian contexts, you won't be adding points very, very often. But how to do that? You simply hit A, add points. And once you're done with that, you simply hit make a double click where you want to add a point. And then you can see, well, now there is a point. It's selected, so it's marked in red. A point without any information added is not really valuable. It just carries information about its coordinates. One thing you might want to do in humanitarian context is you might have information that there is a school or a place around here, and you might want to add a place name then. But typically, we don't add points. We add lines for roads and rivers, and we add areas for buildings, which what Blake will cover on. So when we have a look here at the scenario, you see that someone already added a road in here, but there's nothing much mapped in here. What I can see is when I look at this isolated building here with this field, I can see, well, there's something like an access road. So let us see how we can map this access road. And then when you are in selection mode, you simply hit A for add points, which is this icon here. And then you simply, well, we start from this road here. I click once here. And when you move the mouse, you see that you can move the line, and you can move it up here, and you can end that with a double click. So now we added a line which is connected to this road, but then we have to add tags because, well, it doesn't stand for its own. So for this, we can use the presets menu. We've got highways and all kinds of streets in here. And in this case, this ways a track would be more appropriate because this is just going into this field. It doesn't really connect to an image or something like that. When you select one of those presets, a form comes up, which can be a little bit intimidating, but don't worry. You only have to enter anything where you know something specific. And when we do remote mapping, we hardly know anything about the objects we see than just what they are. We don't know names, we don't know width, and we don't know any access privileges because that's what you can only see on the ground. So typically, all the presets given here are fine, and we simply hit add preset. And then we see now that it's marked differently. It's a tiny dashed line. And when we look here at the tags window, we see that highway equals track has been added. If you're not sure about what kind of object to select, what kind of preset to choose for a different kind of wrapped object, there is a wonderful wiki page which can help you. And on the OpenStreetMap wiki, that is Wiki Map Features. It covers all the basic features categorized. For instance, when you're looking here for education, you can see that there are colleges, kindergartens, schools, different kinds of schools, universities, general research institutes, and there's also transportation. And of course, when we get down further, we can look for roads. highways, and it will tell us. But this here is mainly from the perspective of an industrialized country. I'll show you another web page soon, where we can see the different kinds of roads. And so this wiki page of map features gives you general guidelines, what to select. If you know all the kind of object you see, but you don't know which preset to choose, it's a good idea to have a look at this web page and to select features then after having inspected what is available. You should always carefully read instructions when you do humanitarian mapping in a context organized by HOT, because then you will frequently be in mapping instructions which tell you which particular presets to use for different features. And very often in this case, context, you will run across a page which is called Highway Tag Africa. Sorry for that, should have noted that earlier. And this one is written with the context of a developing country in mind. So it gives a more detailed explanation what kind of types, different kinds of roads to use in countries where paved roads definitely not the standard. So this one will tell you that a track, for instance, accesses agricultural and forest areas, but no settlements. So you have to use other roads, for instance, unclassified roads, to connect settlements. So it is important to keep that in mind, that we have to adopt different perspectives, whether we are mapping in industrialized countries or in developing countries. And it is always important to keep in mind that when these preset forms appear, that you never have to fill in all the fields. When validating data, I've seen roads mapped with one way equals no, and with horse equals yes, and with bicycles equals yes. That really isn't worth it. When we do remote mapping, we just see there is a highway here. We can roughly classify it. Does it only lead into a field? Is it connecting villages? Is it connecting major settlements? This will help us in the classification, but there is hardly anything else to add. Same goes for buildings. We typically see there is a building, but we cannot determine its function when we just look at it on remote imagery. Another point, what we can map here is rivers. So we can see there is at least part of a river which flows down there. And this will double click. And of course, there's another preset for water. And then I could say, well, that is a river. Now we have two things to keep in mind. First of all, rivers have definite flow direction, which you will not be able to distinguish when you just see such a little excerpt. Normally, the direction in which I draw is the direction of flow. So what I would do is a node or even a fix me, and then I said flow direction undetermined, and that leaves a message for another mapper that I'm not sure in which direction this one will flow. So whenever you're not sure about an object, it's quite a good idea to add a fix me, so another mapper who comes by that and sees that my different opinion can be evaluated by people on the ground who have a closer look and fill in the missing gaps. When we have objects like roads and rivers, it is important to note, do they have to be connected or not? When I was drawing this road here, I made a connection to this other road. So this one here, this node here, is a part of this road and it's part of this road. It's important for routing algorithms because if these roads are not physically connected, then no one will know that you can drive from here into there. So objects connected in reality must be physically connected here in the database. Objects which are not connected in reality should not be connected. It is important when it comes to crossings of rivers and roads. We can see that something is split in here. And when I see here, someone added ford equals yes. Well, this is not a ford, but a bridge. but this bridge might be pretty recent. So I think this mapping here is maybe more historical. So what we can do in here is we can adjust this a bit. We delete this ford equals yes, because it is no longer a ford. And I open this preset window again. I can say, well, let's call it a bridge. And then we also have to make sure that the bridge is above the river. So I can add a layer of 1, which means it's above the surface, which is always layer 0. So these layers, of course, have nothing to do with the data layers we were talking about previously. The layers in here are just a vertical model of how objects are arranged in reality. So 0, the default is always the surface of the Earth. If something is above the surface, it must get a positive layer. If, for instance, we'd be mapping a tunnel, we have to assign a negative layer number. And then we don't need any connection between this river and the road, because there is no physical connection. The road is above the river. If it were a real ford, then we should ensure that there is a node which connects those two bits, and because they are there in reality, these connections. And it is quite important that we get right, because when we are talking about humanitarian aid and when we are talking about the rainy season, it makes a big difference whether this river can be crossed on a bridge or through a ford. During high water, fords may not be usable, bridges might be. So when you're drawing roads, you should always make sure that you only connect them to other roads and that they don't touch or intersect buildings, because they don't do that in reality. We want to have a network, but only a network of those objects which connect. So when we have to add things in between, such as if this road would be drawn without any intersection in here, and we'd have to add a bridge, then we run into trouble that we have to split a road, but that's pretty easy. You simply connect a node where you want to split in, and then there is this icon up there which says split away at the selected node. There's also a keyboard shortcut P, and when you do that, we now have 2 separate objects. And you can also combine objects, just select those here, and there is a combine. And then I reverted basically that previous option. So that is basically what you should know about how to map these roads and rivers, or in the same way one would also map railway lines, of course. There are a few options where direction really matters. Rivers are one of them, as I already mentioned. Another one would be one-ways, but this is another we're not encountering in a humanitarian context. So these are the 2 most basic objects: isolated points and lines, which is for roads and rivers mostly. Are there any questions so far? Well, if that is not the case, in order to save a bit of time, I think I would hand the session back to Blake, so that you can continue with the shapes and buildings.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael. I'll let me just find where I am on our agenda. Okay, so that was, sort of an introduction of the basic points and lines and how to tag them. And then we have space for Q&A, so you can still get a question in if you have it. And then I'm going to go over a little bit more of using the building tool and complicated buildings, multi-polygons, and common errors, and kind of show you how to fix those. And so I also have, I'm going to put in chat here, which is what I was trying to get to. We also have a project where we talked about, okay, we can go and practice our mapping on an actual hot project. And so I would encourage you now to listen to what I'm saying, but also feel free to, if you just want to jump into a project and try. This is the project. Let's see here. This needs to go to everyone. that's the project. It's in the group chat that you can go to and try, and that'll give you a sense of the layers that you get when you go from the tasking manager. You'll automatically get a data layer, and you may or may not automatically get an imagery layer, probably not. The instructions should say which imagery layer you want to use, and you would have to go to the imagery menu and add that. So as long as I have a tasking manager project up here, I am just going to do that. So this is our sample project that we're going to map from, and I'm going to go ahead and check out a task square from there, and I'm going to say start mapping. Hopefully you've done this once before. This might say ID for you now, but you're going to want to change it to JOSM. And when you start, you know, your JOSM generally should look like this. Right, this is generally how I start. When I'm done editing a task square, I get rid of all my layers, unless it's an imagery layer. But I generally get rid of all my layers so that when I come out and check out a task and I say start editor, I don't have any confusion about which data layer I'm using. There's only one. This is the one that the tasking manager created for us. You can see it hashes out where it didn't download the data, and it just downloads the data in this area. If I look at the instructions for this project, it says use digital globe standard imagery. So I would come up to my imagery menu and I would find digital globe standard imagery, and I would load that imagery. And this is a buildings and roads project, and I can see that there's a fair number of roads that aren't mapped, and there's a fair number of buildings that aren't mapped. So the first thing that I'm going to cover is the building tool, and you saw a little bit of this before. One thing I might like you to notice is one of the reasons I asked you to use digital globe standard is because that's not what this was mapped with. So really the first thing that I'm going to have to do is probably adjust my imagery. I can see that this looks off a little bit. So I would come up and I'd use this imagery button. It didn't give me a choice of imagery layers because I only have one imagery layer. So you saw before, if I had another imagery layer like Bing, which we're not going to use, but if I had another imagery layer like Bing, when I click on this button, it gives me my choice. But when I only had one layer, it didn't bother to ask. So I'm just going to say digital standard. And, you know, how nice, it remembered the window position. That's also new. And I'm going to right click, and I'm just going to move this imagery a little bit so it lines up better with the existing mapping, which it still is kind of hard to do, but I would get it aligned with the existing mapping first. And then I say, okay, and then I would carry on. And we're talking about the building tool. That's sort of what I was going to demonstrate. And this looks like a good building for the building tool. And so, again, these are tools icons. These are the panel icons. But I could click on the building tool, but I'm going to use the B key. It's very easy to remember. B key for the building tool. And my icon changes. Hopefully you can see that my icon changes a little bit. This is the selection tool, drawing a square. And this is the building tool, and it's going to draw a rectangular building for me. And so I'm going to draw this building, and I'm zoomed in, so it's a little pixelated, but that's okay. This looks like the edge of the roof to me. So I'm going to just start with this corner, and I'm going to go up to what looks like the edge of the roof to me, which this looks like the edge of the roof to me. And that's the only wall I have to map. I'm not holding anything down. It's just pulling out a square for me. And I could literally map this building. You know, I could map this building like that and it would be acceptable. It already has, I'm going to hit S key for my selection tool so I can look at, I can't tell what this thing has for tags. And unless I have my selection tool, I can't select it. So I can see this has the building tag and that's it. And this is not wrong. This would be okay. You know, you've covered the footprint of the building and you don't have quite all of this detail. And the building tool makes it very easy to do more of these. I would just get the building tool and I would just, you know, zap out another building. This looks like a building, and I could carry on mapping my buildings. As always, you assume the building goes under the tree, especially if you can see a little part of it. But this particular building also has another shape to it, and it has this little L shape that I didn't map in here. And so for a complicated building like this, where you want to try and get it as accurate as it can be, this is okay. This counts as a building, covers the footprint, but we want this to be accurate. We would edit this so that we could so that we could make some changes to it. You could start with the S key, and the S key, when this is selected, it's hard to see, but this is a plus sign. This is a node. The nodes are square. I'm going to open up another panel that I often have to open up, so I'm going to go over to the panels. And I'm just going to show you that you can change how these things are rendered. JOSM lets you use different styles to change how this is rendered. And I thought there might be a difference, and then there's a wireframe rendering. But we'll stick with the JOSM default, but you can change this, but Potlatch is sometimes pretty good, but the JOSM default looks good. And I'm going to close this panel up because I don't need to see it again. But I could grab one of these pluses, and this is, if this were a road, I could add a node to it that would let me, I could certainly add a node to it here, and I could fix it that way, and this is the long way. Actually, that one doesn't need to be there. This is the long way. I would just move this one back. And I could fix that building like that. I need to square its corners. That's the Q key. That's another key for you to learn to make sure that it's square. But I could have fixed that building like that. But I am going to fix it a different way. And so the other way that you can fix it is with this, one of the 3 tools that we said you should learn over on the tools area, and that's the extrude tool. So I'm going to grab this extrude tool. It's also the X key. So I generally hit the X key. And you saw me do this real quickly before, but wherever I double click, I'm going to add a node. And then I can also grab a line of the building and change it. So that lets me really, again, I need my selection tool because I want to deselect this. So I S key, and now I can deselect that and look at it. But that's probably the easiest way to make complicated buildings. And I just don't see another good complicated building. But using the X tool is the way to go, because that lets you double click and then you just push and pull these things in. If there were a doorway here, I just double clicked and put 2 cut lines in, and then I pull out a doorway. And that's probably the easiest way to deal with complicated buildings. I'm just going to map another building here real quick. So I'm going to get my building tool. And if you'll remember, the building tool acts differently because I have another building selected. So as soon as I start to map this building, I don't even get to trace one line. It's going to have to be on line with that existing building. And that looks about right to me, and that's great. But if you have nothing selected, then you have to just do it freehand. So I'm just going to freehand draw another building here. And I'm going to draw that building. And I don't know how well you can see it or not. S key to get back my selection tool so I can drag this. I need the selection tool to move it, of course. But this is not very good. And so there's 2 other sets of keystrokes. One second. There's 2 other sections of key in the keystroke section in the document that I shared, which I can share again. There's some keystrokes it wants you to learn. This is 2 of them. It's the Control and Shift key lets me rotate this building, so I could easily get this thing so that it lines back up. And then the other one you want is the Control and Alt key. And this lets me make it bigger or smaller. So if I just overdrawn it or I was fixing somebody else's, I could just quickly scale it and rotate it. That's super helpful for mapping buildings. So that's on the agenda document at the bottom. It's Control Shift to rotate, and it's Control Alt to scale, to zoom it in and out. The other thing that's brand new, this is brand new in the buildings tool, and so nobody knows that this works this way, except now you will, is that, remember how I told you plugins can change the menus? Well, the buildings tool changes the data menu. And we've been making rectangles, but we can also make circles with the buildings tool. So set building shape to circle. Now, when I get my building tool with the B key, my icon's changed a little bit. Now it looks more like a farm silo. And now you do one line and it makes a circle and it tags it as a building. So that's brand new. Nobody knows it does that but us at this point in time. But that's a way, the first imagery we looked at was all round buildings, and this would have been a fast way to do it. But generally, you're going to want to map rectangular buildings. And then, like I said, my personal preference is to use the X key and then cut shapes in and pull them out as needed. Another very common way of mapping a complicated building, I'm going to pretend that this is an L-shaped building. So I'm going to get my building tool, and I'm going to map. Whoops, I have something selected. That's why I can look over here in my selection panel. This tells me I have something selected. Something obviously has a building tag, but specifically this is the selection panel. So what I do is I just use the escape key. Escape stops me from mapping, and escape again deselects everything. That's why I get really used to the escape key. So I'm just going to go, oops, that's not the building I want to do, escape key. So I'm just going to draw a building like this, and then I'm going to draw this long part of it and just cover that building with it a little bit. And that was not a great example because I didn't do a very nice job. This is really hard to see, I'm sure, too, in the webinar. But you can do this. If you have a complicated building, you can also just draw multiple buildings. Or if you have a building, you know, that there's just no way to tell it apart, you can draw multiple polygons for it and then get your selection key and, you know, draw a square. Whoops, get your selection key with a square and draw a square around them. And then come up here to the Tools menu and choose Shift J. This is another one where you have to just memorize Shift J, but that joins overlapping areas. And so now I have a pretty complicated building that I made by just drawing individual polygons and then joining them. And I'll just do that one more time. I'll do that for this L-shaped building. B key, I have something selected, so I don't want that. Escape key, B key. I think this is an L-shaped building too. So I would draw that part of the building, and then I would draw this part of the building and make sure they overlap. And then I S key to get my selection tool so that I can, holding down the Shift key now just to select two at a time. I could have also just drawn a selection tool around them. And then Shift J, under Tools, Shift J joins them. And that lets you make complicated buildings by drawing individual polygons. There's also another note here that is important, and we haven't really looked at it. It hasn't come up. We're using the building tool, so everything ends up tagged properly. But you can accidentally add tags to a node, which if it's just a node all by itself, if I'm just marking this as a tree, for example, then I have to add tags to this node. And I would go to presets, and I would search, and I would say tree. And I would select that one, and I would fill in whatever it was, and I would apply the presets to it. But if you have a node that's part of another object, then you always want the tags to go on the main object, right? You don't want to put the house tag on one node or the building equals yes tag on one node. You just want to make sure that you're putting it on the whole object. And the same is true for a road. This road has a tag on it that says, you know, highway equals road, but the individual nodes don't have any tags on them. And they're just part of this way, and the tags are on the way. So you always want to tag whatever the biggest object is. If it's a whole area, tag the whole area. If it's a road, tag the whole road. Only if it's a standalone do you want to tag an individual node. So just be careful about that, because you can accidentally try, especially if you're zoomed out too far, you can try and select a building and get a node. This may or may not happen in ID, I don't know, but it happens with us. Okay, so these are all junk. So I'm just going to select all those with my selection tool and delete it. And I think, yeah, I guess I won't be able to save any of this because I don't know what its accuracy is. But that's how to create complicated buildings. The only other slightly more complicated thing that you can do is, and this comes up almost never, and like I said, as I showed you, even if there's a complicated building, even if you just went so far as to, let's just take this building, for example. I'm going to hit the delete key to get rid of that. This looks like a building with a courtyard in it. To me, this looks like a building with a courtyard in it. And I'm going to B key to get the building tool. And that literally would not be wrong. You could map this whole thing as one building like that. If that's the best that you can tell, you could do this. But a better way to map it would be to map. So this is okay if you're good with this. But a better way to map it is to then, you know, this is sort of the outside of the building, and I'm just going to also map the courtyard. And that's the courtyard of the building. And now, again, using my selection tool, the S key, I'm going to shift click to get both of these things. And I can come up to Tools, and I can say create a multi-polygon. And like I said, this is not something that happens very often, but if we use this for islands and lakes, you use this for buildings with holes in them. There's other applications. It doesn't come up very much, but now this makes this one building. It's interesting. But now this makes this one building. And you can see that its tags and membership panel changes. And this is where the membership panel of this comes in, where now this is saying this is two members in a multi-polygon called building. So if you see this, it means that they're in some sort of a relation to each other. Between you and me, if you see this, if you see something in the membership area, I just move on, right? I'm not very good at editing relations, so I don't worry about it very much. This is the simplest kind of a relation you can have. and it's easy to make, but it would have been okay if it wasn't. And if there's something that's part of a relation, I just generally don't edit it. It doesn't come up very often, administrative boundaries. Sometimes people do residential areas this way, but I generally don't edit it. That's advanced editing that I'm not going to, nobody's covered it for me yet, so I can't cover it for you yet. But that's how you create a multi-polygon building. Let's see here. So common errors is also on the list of this. And you've all seen this, and you might have all done this. It just happens. So I'm going to get the building tool again. I'm going to make sure I don't have anything selected with my escape key. And I'm going to get my building tool key again. And you can see these icons change, but I'm using the... So if I were trying to... Let's see here. Can I even do this? Yeah, I can't even do this with the... Yeah, it's probably a little bit more accurate to do this the other way. So I'm going to delete this road. And I'm going to add a road here. So I start with the node that I want to start with, and then I either use the A key or I click on this add. This is what Michael showed you, the add button, but I just hit the A key. And so I'm going to add to this road, and this can happen really often. And so what you see I've done here is I've accidentally connected the road to this building or to a residential area or to anything else. And the easy way to fix this in JOSM is to get your selection tool and then select one of these things. Sometimes you have to select both, but definitely select one. And then I'm going to guess this is under the tools section, and you say unglue the ways, or the G key. I believe the G key is in the list of, you should learn these. And that disconnects the node from that house. It creates a new node on the road and disconnects it from that house. And I just fixed that very common error. Happens all the time, and that's the easy way to fix it. It also can happen with buildings. If your buildings are close together and you accidentally, start one that touched another corner, they can be joined, and you'll want to use your selection tool and then G for unglue, and that'll disconnect them for you, and then you can fix them. So that's another real common way that nodes get shared. And it's super subtle, but you should notice that you should be able to notice, and this is going to be hard to see in my view, but this square is larger than these squares. See how this is a tiny node? Whoops. This is a tiny node, and this node is a little bit bigger. That's indicating in JOSM that these are two nodes together. I mean, we know this because I can see it, but that's when you see the slightly larger nodes, that means that that's because multiple ways are sharing that same node. So that's a good indication. Okay, so upload in the built-in validator. Okay, great. Let me just cover upload in the built-in validator, and then we can switch to the practical time and screen sharing and answering, harder questions from stuff that we've missed here. So I've done all of this mapping, and I'm going to upload it to OpenStreetMap, even though I know it's not accurate. I'm just going to go ahead. And the way that you do that, the way that you upload data, is you use this icon, which is an arrow pointing up. Remember, I got this data by downloading it. When I came from the tasking manager and I said, start editor, it opened JOSM, and it had already downloaded, like these roads had already downloaded in this residential area. That data was already there because the remote control told JOSM, this is the area you're concerned about, download all the data. So we didn't do a download process here. That happened automatically. We're doing typical hot mapping where now I'm done mapping and I want to upload. So I'm going to hit the upload button. And this happens all the time, and it's great because this does a validation process on all of what you've mapped, and only on what you've mapped. So if there was other data down there with problems, it's not going to tell you about them, but it will tell you about problems with your mapping. And they're the same sort of problems that you used to get a warning for in ID. And this tells me, this is new, by the way, building with an almost square angle. It's a brand new test, and it's just a warning. We can zoom to it. You can right-click on these things. Well, I guess you can't. You can say cancel. And then it opened up a new panel. It put a validation results panel in here for me, and it has that same list of errors. And it also added a validation layer. And the validation layer changes, what this looks like. See, now these have these outlines around them. And that's from this validation layer, which you could turn off. if it's making it confusing for you to figure out what it's talking about. Just come up here and toggle its eye off. But now you can zoom to these things. So I did a right click on this and I said zoom to problem. And it is, I guess this is the problem. It's not really outlined what the problem is, but it probably means this building. Not quite square. So I could square it, and that's the Q key. So I could square that building and just fix it. And then this says untagged ways. So I drew these two ways and I didn't give them tags. So I would have to fix that. My preferred method for adding tags, we could do the presets. You could search the presets. My preferred way for adding tags, and I suggest that you do this as well based on how we map, is using the Alt key and the A. And that brings up this dialog box that says, what do I want? Well, this is a road, so I know it's highway. And it's auto-completing for me. And so I say this is highway equals service. This is like a driveway. And so this will often be in the instructions, or you'll just learn what these are and then say, okay. And now that's tagged. And then I would do Alt-A again, because now I need to tag this other road. And the nice part about Alt-A is it remembers the last thing that I did. So this was a highway equals service. This is not. This is highway equals residential. But I would add the highway equals residential tag. But what I really like you to notice is when I say Alt-A, it's remembering like the last 20 tags that I've used. This one's grayed out because I can't apply it, but these two, in theory, I could apply. Obviously, highway doesn't go on a building. But so if you're adding fords, bridges, communications towers, residential areas, all that'll be in your list. And so it's really easy to just do Alt-A. It'll bring up list of stuff you've used, and you would just double click on it to apply it. You know, so I just applied the highway tag to this building. But that's the way that I generally tag things. If I had to add a Ford somewhere, I'm going to turn back on my imagery. If I had to add a Ford somewhere, I would do, you know, I would add the node. You know, let's say this was a Ford node. I would add the node, and I would say Alt-A. And then, and you can get a list of all the, you know, these are all the tags that you could use. I could use highway, you know, they're all here, but typing them is easiest. So land use, you can see land use, it auto-completes. And I could say residential, and it auto-completes. And it'll get added to my recently used tags. That's my preferred way of doing the tagging. Going through presets works just as well. The building tool, of course, you don't ever have to add a tag. But if you're doing any other kind of mapping, I would suggest Alt-A because it'll remember the last tags you've used. Common errors, built-in validator. So we're still kind of going over the built-in validator. So I would fix these. I would zoom to the problem, and then I would select it. And this is highway equals service. And this is highway equals residential. That's fixed. This is okay. I'm just going to ignore that one. You'll get validation results that you don't know what to do with. So if I run, now that this validation panel is open, this is the checkbox that toggles it on and off. If I just don't select anything, escape key, and I just run validation, it'll validate everything that's on the screen, not just the stuff that I mapped. And you can see now it has an error, which it would like you to fix the errors. That's the suggested. So it's right here where I've been messing around. There's some kind of, oh, I had a duplicate node somehow. So what I would do is, I think they showed you, I would just shift click on both of these, and then I would say, oh, I would use the M key to merge them, merge nodes. And now that problem should be fixed at least. So if I just click off and run the validation again, now I don't get that error. But I do get 12 warnings because some of this stuff I didn't do, like untyped, unspecified highway type. That's because these are all tagged as road, and that gets a warning. Warnings are things you could look at and you should fix if you can, but it's not required. So somebody else mapped this and marked it roads. That's good with me. So I'm just going to go ahead and say upload. I get the same warnings, except this is on the stuff that I mapped. And I could say continue. I'm going to say continue to upload. This tells me all of the things that I've added, all of the things that I've modified and what I've deleted. This is where I would put in my change set comment. You can see this is sort of filled in automatically from the tasking manager. This is the tasking manager sent this over. This is where I have to specify which imagery I used, and it generally goes by, in theory, it's supposed to go by what's active over here, but it doesn't because this says Bing and we use Digital Globe. So I would just type in Digital Globe. Digital Globe standard, DG standard. And then I would say upload. And this would upload stuff to OpenStreetMap. It's live data. So I'm not going to click on upload. So if you're practicing, remember, you're still putting stuff into OpenStreetMap Live. But this is how I would go about uploading data. You can check this box that said, I'd like somebody to review my edits. Us as hot mappers don't have to check that because somebody's going to validate this anyway. If you're mapping somewhere else on your own, not using the tasking manager, go right ahead and check this if you're not too sure about your editing. And then somebody from OpenStreetMap will look at your editing and give you feedback on it. But if you did a hot task, somebody's going to look at your mapping and give you feedback on it anyway. So this is just extra, and you can skip it because we already have, you know, folks that are going to do that. And just try and keep these to where there's nobody who's going to check it again, like if you're editing around your house or something. So I would say upload changes, and I'm going to let it do it. So it just put those objects into, oh, okay, I have a conflict somewhere. Somebody was editing near me, and I have a conflict. In which case, as far as this course goes, just say cancel, and you got to start over. So cancel, and you would just delete all your layers. You're going to delete this without uploading. You're going to just save your imagery layer, and then you would just come back and say start editor again, and you would have to start again. Because I can't tell you how to solve the conflicts. That's an hour in and of itself. But that's hopefully the tasking manager. There's a lot less of that. It's a little bit more likely with roads than it is with buildings, so that shouldn't happen too often. So I'm just going to get in here, and I'm going to map a couple of buildings. Building, building, building. And again, to use this tool, you click once. I'm not holding down. I'm just kind of taking the line to the end, and then I'm not holding down for any of this. This is just clicking and going. And then I'm going to say upload. There's no errors. Everything was fine. Great. It has the default. It has the default tag in here with needs to add a space to it. DG standard. Upload my changes, and now everything is set. I can keep editing. I can go add more buildings. Right. I don't have to do anything else. I can add more buildings. I could add another 10 buildings, and then I would just say upload again. You know, upload after every, 10 buildings or so is what I tell people to do. And then I could just upload again. And that's the basics of that. I think that's where I'm going to stop. And so now it's now I think we move on to you can work on this project. I put the link into I'm just going to get rid of my data layer. I'm going to get rid of my imagery layers. I'm just going to clean out my JOSM. Come back to tasking manager, and I'm going to say stop mapping, of course, because I didn't completely map that square. And now I shared once in the chat for this, there was a tasking manager project, which maybe if I zoom out here, I can see people are working on the tasking manager project. Does anybody have any questions? Let's just go over on anything.
Blake?
Yes.
Blake, could you just go over how to download from the tasking manager into JOSM? One or two questions have come up about that.
Okay. So we're at the tasking manager, and this should happen for you automatically. So I'm on the mapping tab, and I have a task square selected, and I say start mapping. That checks out the task square for me. And now when I say start the editor for JOSM, the data has been downloaded. There just is no data here. So I would come up to my imagery, and we're using Digital Globe standard imagery. So there's nothing to map here. So that was not a good example. I'm just going to delete my data layer. I'm going to delete my data layer. I'm going to come back to the hot tasking manager, and I'm going to mark as completely mapped. By the way, if you haven't used the tasking manager, you can change to imagery in the tasking manager so that you can make sure you pick a task square that's not all forest if you want to. So this one is not all forest, so I'm going to pick this tasking manager square. Well, you would have thought that would have worked. I'll say select a task at random. Okay. There's mapping to do in here for sure. And I'm going to say start mapping. And when I say start editor, changes me over. It made a data layer for me, and it downloaded the data. So I don't ever have to download data from the tasking manager. That just happens automatically. I would do my mapping. I would map in a couple of buildings, and then I would upload. It's good if you fix that space. And then I would upload my changes. So there's no real downloading while you mapping from the tasking manager. The place where you have to worry about downloading data is when you're working on this yourself. So if I go someplace that I'm not using a tasking manager project, I'm just going to go over somewhere here. I'm going to just try and find a settlement here. Okay. Okay. All right. Yeah, it'd be great if I could find a settlement somewhere easy. I guess I don't need to find a settlement, but that would have been great if I did. Okay. Africa. Sometimes there's just not enough stuff. Okay, so if I was going to map here, for example, I wanted to map this little village. I haven't gotten this from the tasking manager, and I don't have a data layer. And so what I would do is, you know, always check your layers first to figure out what's up here. Maybe I was doing editing somewhere else, but I don't have a data layer. So what I would do is I would come in here and I would say download the data for this area. And because I do not have a data layer and I say download, it's going to automatically create a data layer for me. And now I can start working. And it has the same crosshatch where there's no data, and it's clear imagery where there is data. So that's how you download data on your own. And then you could start mapping. You would map, somebody already did a couple of buildings, you would start mapping. And when you were all done, if I came in here and I did my mapping, and I added a building, and I uploaded, this comment doesn't apply anymore. I guess it does apply. Russ, any chance you could get in there and edit that project? Whoops. Unless I think maybe you just did. But anyhow, I would upload, and that would just be that. And then I would delete that data layer. You know, you can move around, right? So like if I mapped all of this and now I just want to go north a little bit, you can just move north and say download data. And what I want you to pay attention to is if I download this data right now, there's a special checkbox that says download as new layer. So it would create a new data layer for you. That's not checked. And you can see this indicates where the data has already been downloaded for once. So I'll say download data, and it just adds it to that layer. And now I have more data on that layer. And it changed the crosshatch, and now I have the open space. And I could download this part too. As long as I don't check this, it's just going to keep downloading the data and adding it to my, you know, whatever I'm working on. If you wanted to download the data to a new layer, you could just check this box and say download data. And you can see it's created a new layer for me here. And it's only that little bit. The stuff that's downloaded in this other data layer doesn't have anything to do with what's downloaded in this layer. So now they're going to be different. If I edit in this layer and then I come back over here, you can make yourself conflicts doing that. So try to work in one data layer as much as possible. It's much less confusing. Are there more questions that are related to anything that we've talked about?
Yeah, like there's been some coming across the chat. I don't know if you're watching that, but let me.
Can you share some of them? Let me see if. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. I didn't mean to stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, I'm just looking back to see where I kind of left off. Sorry, I got involved with private chats, but yeah. So from Brian, I think is kind of the.
Is Emily still here?
Yeah, I see Emily still on there. So yeah, actually that might be a good, you know, go back to that and see if we can figure out why she can't select stuff.
Yeah, Emily, if you could unmute yourself and share your screen, then we're happy to look at that. In the meantime, did you see another project from someone or another question from someone, Ross?
Yeah. Yeah, so Brian's question is it possible to see more than one zoom level at a time? I don't think so, but it would actually be kind of a neat plugin to have like a, you know, a different zoom level that you could, you know, kind of keep it a consistent zoom, and then while you're zooming in and out on the main. I don't know if there is does anybody know, is there a plugin or anything that does that?
That lets you, I don't know how to see more than one zoom level at a time. I think the answer to that one is no. I mean, now it somehow snaps you into Oh boy, you'd think I could find a giant city somewhere in Tanzania. Oh, goodness. Okay, all right, we're going to have to look at the United States just in the interest of time.
Blake?
Yes.
Just to bring your attention, there's another question about one or two people having the JOSM remote control did not respond. It sounds like they don't have the remote checked.
That could very well be true. Yeah, that could very well be true. If the other thing that can happen is you can get more than one copy of JOSM open. So definitely look down here and make sure you only have one copy of JOSM open. If not, you're going to want to go to Edit Preferences, and then there's a picture of a remote control. And you should make sure that you have Enable Remote Control Support checked. I don't know if you need HTTPS, but we enabled it and we did the install certificate and just clicked through OK until we were done. So we checked this and nothing happens. You check this and then there's a dialog for install. So make sure those are both enabled. Otherwise, make sure you don't have more than one copy of JOSM open. So I had a quick question about selecting more than just the stuff that I've edited or selecting more than one object. I failed to find a great example here, but this is okay. And so I've downloaded some data. I created a new data layer and I just said download data. I didn't have any data layer. So I just said download data, whether this is checked or not, it's going to always create a new data layer if I don't have one. And so you can select, you can use the selection tool, which is the S key. When it's the lasso, you can go around and select, just the things you want to select. The other thing you can do is, you can draw a box around stuff to select it. But the best way to, another way to select things that is JOSM superpower is we've looked at this selection tab, right? And this tells you how many things you have selected, the panel. Down here is a search button. And this search button lets you search for things with tags. So you can search for building equals, and then we typically use a star. So that means anything that has the building key, any value, that's what you want to search for. And it found, if I zoom out, you can see it found everything that has a building tag for any value. And now you're seeing over here in the tags and membership panel, now you're seeing like, there's 9 different and 190 are unset on amenity. So you can see that there's different settings. And I don't suggest you do this, but it's a bit of a trick. You can double click on this and then look at the pop-down list and it will tell you, I have 1 bank selected, 1 bar selected, 1 cafe, fast food, fire station, place of worship, restaurant, shelter, and social facility. I mean, that's everything that I need pretty much. But there's one of those that these are the 9 that are tagged. And then there's 190 that don't have anything in the amenity tag. Carefully try not to change them. If you select anything here, it will set them all to that. So just hit your escape key to get back out. But it definitely is, some cool stuff you can do. And so the searching, so I did, building equals yes, but I could do building equals amenity. No, I could do building equals house. And there's only a few that are labeled as building equals house. So you can come in and find all the highway equals residential. And that would select all of the roads that are tagged as residential. And they're selected. So I could do something to them. Like if all of these roads were not supposed to be residential, I could come in here and change them all at once. Like they all say residential. What if I want them all to be footway? Now I just changed 69 ways to say highway equals footway. So you can select multiple things and change multiple things, and search is a powerful way to do that, as is the lasso tool to just grab what you want. And then you can edit them en masse. I could delete them, I could square them. This is how you square a lot of buildings at once. You say building equals yes, you might put in less than 11 nodes so you don't get round ones, and then you hit the square button and it squares them all at once. But yeah. Any more questions? I mean, hopefully there's more questions. Do people have more questions?
Hi, this is Emily.
Emily.
Hey, it won't let me share the screen while you're sharing.
Okay, well, I just stopped sharing my screen.
Okay. Let me know when you can see it.
I can see it.
Okay. For these two here, am I supposed to be able to see something when I let go of the mouse, or is that simply to select an area like that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's
Okay.
just the selection tool. So if there's no data, there's nothing to select. And you
Okay.
did it over here, and it selected those individual nodes.
Got it. Okay, so the only way to make an actual box that stays there is this B.
You mean to edit the map? The only way to
Okay.
edit the map?
Sorry?
Yeah, so to add something to the map, you use the A tool, the third one from the top.
Okay. Yeah.
And now you could do a road, or you could do a building.
Okay. Got it.
And just
Okay.
click, and then double click to finish. Yeah, what you did.
Okay.
So you just did two different things here, right? So this is what I tell people, just practice with this once. Hit that A tool. And if you've used ID, you know there's three different tools, right? There's a point tool, a road tool, and a building tool.
Okay.
This A tool is all three of those things. You just use it three different ways. So if you have the A tool, just double click someplace. And that's adding points. So you just added a point. And now if you click once and then drag and click and drag, make a road, click. And now you just made a way. And just double click to finish. And now take one of those buildings using that same tool, one of those buildings, not the one that's already mapped, an unmapped building, and just map it. And that's exactly how you map stuff in ID.
Got it.
And so now we would add tags to these. This is how you used to do all the mapping in JOSM. So get your selection tool. Generally, I hit the S key or get your, right? Now you've clicked on that building, right? Or it was already selected.
Okay.
It's red, so it's selected. Go ahead. Can you get, okay, great. And so you're missing some panels over here. If you could go over to the icons that turn on and off the panels, down, they're the second set of icons on the left, second set on the bottom. Nope, those are all tools. And then there's a double arrow. There's a black double arrow.
Oh, yeah.
And then below that,
Yeah.
below that, those are the panels.
Okay.
So you click on the first one, and it turned on your layers panel over on the right.
Okay.
Okay, and so you clicked on, and then click on the third one from the top. And okay, those are the three panels that you want to have up.
Okay.
You want to have the layers up at the top so you can see what's going on, tags and membership, and then what you have selected. Okay. And so you have one building selected if you look in that panel, one way, and it's 4 nodes. And there's nothing in the tags. So click on that right above there in the tags panel, click on the add, yep, great. There's an add button. Yes, exactly. And so this is a building. So let's just type in the building key for it. Building, tab, and then tab key. And then yes. Okay. And you just mapped and tagged that building. You would want to hit your Q key to square your corners, of course. So just tap the Q. Okay, great. And you just mapped that building.
Okay.
And that's the way that this used to work. That's the way that we used to do this. But now if you grab the building tool, which is just above that double arrow. Exactly. And now go draw one of those 2 skinny buildings in the north there. Oh, that one's fine. You can just hit the escape key. Yeah. Escape key stops you from doing what you're doing. Okay, perfect. And you just map that using the building tool. You could have used just the one tool that you can use to map everything, but we have a tool that makes building tools easier. But let's go back. So you drew those 3 points. Do you see the 3 orphan points there?
Yes.
And you'll need your selection tool, S. And just click on one. Okay, no tags. This one you could hit the delete key. You just hit the delete key.
Just on my computer? Yeah.
Sure, and click on another one. And now let's say we want to tag that one. So go back over to that add button. Yes, exactly. And now we're gonna map a tree. So I think it's what, natural? Type natural. Oh, you got to go back. Natural. Keep going. NATU. Natural, and then tab. And then I think here tree is a value. Perfect. And then say okay. And so you added a tag to that one. And then you drew this road, right? You drew that line. So let's click on that line. It was north of your tree. Yes.
Okay, yes.
Click once on that. And hit your add key. And what I'd like you to notice is, and what I'd like other people to notice is, you see the recently used tags that you've typed in here. You did a tree. So if you were doing another tree, you would just hit return and it would get the tree tag. Or if this were another building, you would just do the building thing. This is a highway, so just type highway. Use the key and tab. And then residential. And then say okay. And that is the manual process of mapping in JOSM. That's the most manual way you can get. I tend to use, I don't use the add button, but I use Alt-A. Alt-A brings up that same dialog box. And it'll have all your previously used tags so you can quickly add them to something.
Got it.
You could have also gone up to the presets menu. You have a presets menu up at the top. And you could have, you could have slidden down to like the highway one and found the right highway and selected it from the menus. This would have worked too. That would have been another way to tag it. Or you could have clicked on search, the preset search up at the top, and typed in residential maybe. I don't know. Let's type in residential. Yeah, highway, streets, residential. You could have tagged it that way. So but I tend to use, because if you use the building tool, you're not doing much tagging.
Right.
So you're only worried about like, oh, this road, I need to add a ford because this road crosses a river. Well, I'll just click on that one node and hit Alt-A because I mapped a ford 20 minutes ago. And then I'll, double click on the ford tag and it'll add it. You'll learn a real comprehensive set of tags that you use.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. I hope that helps. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
So long.
Appreciate it.
Anybody else? I'm going to look at the chat. You could stop sharing your screen. Up at the top, I think if you go up to the top under view options or something.
I paused the share. Is that right? Oh, stop. Okay, got it.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Sure, it's my pleasure, Emily. Does anybody else have any questions or something that they want to show? Rebecca. Wait, Rebecca had a question. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Is that Ralph? Victor.
Yeah, okay, Blake, someone has asked how do you add the fix me tag?
How do you add the fix me tag? Okay, it's super similar to what we just did. So I don't have any data. I'm not looking at any data, but I'm going to go up here and I'm going to say new layer, or I'm going to download. Forget I said new layer.
Hey, Blake, you're not sharing if you're expecting. I don't see your sharing.
Okay, well, you guys aren't looking. No, I'm kidding. I don't have my screen shared. My apologies. So how do you add the fix me tag? And it's exactly what we just did with Emily. So I'm going to download my data for here. And it's going to create a layer automatically. It doesn't matter if that's checked because I do not have a data layer. Download. And something doesn't look right about this road. So I have my selection tool. I hit my S key and I got my selection tool. And these are all the tags that are on it right now. I'm going to click on the add button. And instead of typing building, I'm going to type fix me. And I'm going to say, I am not sure about this classification. And say, okay. And that just added the fix me tag to that road. So it's essentially the exact same process to add a fix me tag. The presets are really good for highways and buildings and stuff that you don't know about. Like I don't know how to tag a water tower. So I'm going to search for water tower, power tower, stuff that I don't know about. But I know like highway equals unclassified and highway equals residential. So those I tend to add by hand. And I really only use the presets for stuff that I don't know. Like if I come across a hospital maybe, I don't know, something like that, I might look in presets. But other than that, I know the key and value pairs. Highway is the key and then all those values are what it can be. Or building is the key, and then it can be house or yes or what have you. So doing Alt-A to bring up what you've recently added really turns into a fast way to add. So if I need to add that same fix me tag, so this is the fix me tag that says I'm not sure about this classification. If I need to add it to the road next door, I click on that road and I'm going to do Alt-A. It's the same as clicking on this add button. And then it's the same comment. So I'm just going to say OK. And I just put that fix me tag on that one now too. And if I come across another one somewhere else, Alt-A, that's the tag I want. So I'm just going to hit the return key. And I just added the fix me tag to that one. So the Alt-A, when you're mapping, can be really fast because maybe you're only doing fords. You're just fixing the road because the validation told you that a road crossed a river. And so now you're going to go fix that by putting ford tags on everything. The Alt-A is just a super easy way, and hit return. It's the last one it was. Or double click on one of the existing ones. Any other questions that Ralph or Russ are seeing?
Yeah, I'll just jump in. So there is some mixed content issues with that whole remote control stuff. So yeah, I can't remember where I most recently saw some conversation around that, but people are still having issues just because of the browser combination with their machine. I think it's typically Apple machines with either Safari or can't think of the other browser that was having problems. But yeah, I would just try different browsers and see if that works. But yeah, it's kind of a more complicated issue than I think we're going to be explaining here.
Yeah, try Chrome. Different web browsers, different versions. Most of them it's okay now, but there's some that where it's still not okay. So just try Chrome or Firefox or Safari and try and get one that doesn't give you a mixed content issue. The other thing I'll just point out real easy, I just made a lot of changes on here that I don't want to upload. So I'm just going to delete that data layer. I'm just, rather than trying to undo those fix me's, if I don't upload, I don't make any changes. So until I hit this upload, everything is stored locally. It's not like ID where as you're making changes, well, ID isn't even really like that. There's still a save process. So the upload is the same as the save process in ID. So if I don't upload anything, all of these changes that I made here, these don't matter because this is all just on my machine. So I'm just going to delete this layer. And now I don't have to, I would just download the layer again if I, really wanted to fix something, but I felt like I couldn't. I would just download the data again and start working with it. And I use my selection key. I'm sorry, there's a question. That must have just been feedback. Any other questions or anybody want to show us something that just is not working right for them or doesn't make sense? Russ, did you stop the video recording at some point?
No, it's still recording on my end.
Okay. I mean, now might be a good time to wrap that up. I'm not going to go. I'm not going to leave. But if you want to turn off the recording, whoever wants to hang out can hang out and answer questions and share screens and stuff like that for, another 15 minutes. Let's say at least another 15 minutes.
Okay, so before I do, there's one from the Unique Mappers. Yeah, welcome. Thanks for joining. So when you download an area image on the black screen, it gives different lines of that area. I think what he's referring to is, just in JOSM, your download area versus outside the download area. Oh, and you are no longer sharing your screen. So
I stopped sharing my screen? Did I stop sharing my screen?
I no longer see it.
I did stop sharing it. I didn't mean to do that. No, I meant, so if I start up JOSM just like this, and I go to the hot tasking manager and then I say start JOSM, you might end up with blackness because you have not added a data layer yet. So the hash mark stuff is where you're not supposed to edit. But if you just have blackness, then this is because you need to come up here and add an imagery layer. In our case, we're using Digital Globe Standard. So I would add the Digital Globe Standard layer. And then it is this dark area on the sides that you're not supposed to edit. And it didn't download any data for over there. It only downloaded data for the place where the picture's clear. Or if you don't have an imagery layer, maybe you do have an imagery layer, but you just don't have it turned on. So make sure that eye icon is on.
Blake,
Yes.
could you point everyone to the Slack channel so that at any future time that they are having a problem, they will have somewhere to go to ask a question?
Absolutely. I also see another question about why am I using Digital Globe Standard? In this case, my determination, and I looked really quick, but if we look at the Bing imagery, the Bing imagery looks older to me. So for example, you can see right here, I'll just map this building in Digital Globe Standard. So there's a building here in Digital Globe Standard, but in Bing imagery, that building's not there. And this building is still a foundation. See that? This is a foundation. And then when I turn off Bing, so I can see Digital Globe, I can see that got completed as a building. There's a building there. There's no building up here. So there's another building here. So this is why I use Digital Globe Standard. And you had to adjust the background imagery, so it was practice. But I primarily did it because it looks like it's much newer than Bing. Slack channel. So we have a Slack, which I will start up, but you should join the Slack by going to this web address, slack.hotosm.org. And it asked you to, this is Slack, this is what Slack looks like, but it asked you to fill out our new Slack invite form. So just fill out this, and it's your name and your email address, and then short description of why you want to join Hot Slack from the webinar is fine. You know what I mean? It's not a novel. It's not an application. We just need your name and your email, and this is to keep spammers. And then once you're in Slack, we have a whole host of channels that you can join. And so there's like a mapper support channel where you can ask questions. You'll automatically be in the general channel, which you're fine to ask any question you want in the general channel. But if you look at, like, you know, these are some of the top people in humanitarian mapping on the planet are in Slack. So you're asking, here's, you know, Matthew Gibbs, who gave the last training seminar, so you could ping Matthew. Anyhow, there's a lot of great people in the Slack, and it's a great place to ask. Just fill out that form. And so it's slack.hotosm.org. And I'll put it